everyone. Welcome to another MennoNerds broadcast. My name is Katelin Hansen, coming to you from Columbus, Ohio. I'm with Church for All People and Community Development for All People. And I am here today with Austin Channing Brown, the author of the new book, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. Definitely recommend folks check it out. And I'm very excited to have this conversation together today. I've been excited for this to come out. Austin, I've been wanting you to write for a while, and
yes,
so
excited
that time came, and I'm excited to be sharing this conversation with you. So welcome.
Oh, Katelin, I'm so glad that this worked out because you were a supporter long time ago. Before most people knew there was a blog, let alone a book. So I'm so glad to be doing this with you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great stuff in the book. There's a lot of great stuff that you've written about previously and talked about publicly. And so I'd love the chance to dig in, and we'll kind of see where some of that goes. But maybe you can just start by telling us a little bit of the background for the book. How did it come about, and kind of what was your mindset going into writing and publishing it?
Sure. So I honestly sort of pitched a version of this book years ago, like maybe 6 years ago. I mean, long time ago. And publisher's initial interest was like, I don't get it. You're gonna write a whole memoir on like white people touching your hair. Like that's the whole memoir. Like, I don't get it. And the truth is that was, before Black Lives Matter. That was before coats burst onto the scene. That was before, really this era that we're now living in. And so memoirs in some respects were considered something very different from the book that I wrote. But I wanted to, I think I live up to that adage of writing the book that you needed. I think I wrote the book that I needed as I was moving in and out of white ministries, around a lot of white Christians, and trying to figure out how to keep hold of myself as I navigated those ministries, particularly as a professional. And so that's really, really how the book was born, was me talking to myself, but also talking to other friends and other Black women who I knew were facing the same things that I was going through. And thankfully, because the times changed, I took my second shot and many publishers were interested, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. I guess a couple of lessons in there in general for anyone trying to do the writing. I mean,
that's right.
Stay with it. And,
that's right.
And one, don't take no for an answer, but also you make an interesting point about just sort of the timeliness and the environment that's so important. And so I definitely want to come back to this idea of cultural climate and maybe some of the shifts that we've seen, but maybe start by talking about just some of the environments that you have found yourself in. You talked about writing the book that you wanted to be able to read. And so what were some of those environments like? Because I think you really push on some important context when it comes to Christian spaces, in particular white Christian spaces, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, so I have worked in homeless shelters. I've worked in nonprofits. I've worked for churches. I've worked for higher ed. I've worked for parachurch ministries. I've done the whole circle around anything that would claim to be even remotely tied to Christian ministry. And before my sort of working life, I have always attended predominantly white private Christian schools. So I attended Assemblies of God school for elementary school and junior high. I was at a Catholic school for high school. My undergrad was Covenant, and my master's degree was Catholic again. So really a big bulk of my life really has been traveling in this sphere of Christian space and Christian ministry.
Yeah, and you write in your book, particularly in some of the earlier chapters, about some of those growing up years in school,
right?
And let's see if I can find it real fast here on the fly. You talk about, and I might not be able to pull the right school at the right time, but
yeah, of
you
course,
talk about that our school's quote unquote racial harmony might not have created that assumption. So, talking about whiteness and the whole culture, but it didn't help unlearn it either. And you're talking about, a teacher that froze intention there, but I think there's broader implications for lots of different settings. So just wanted to prompt you a little bit to talk a little bit more about that difference.
Totally. So my high school experience, I don't remember this, not to say that there weren't, because my high school is pretty large, but I don't remember like a racial incident, like someone got knocked out for using the N-word, or there was like a Halloween bash where people were in blackface, or, you know what I mean? Like, I don't remember swastikas written in the classroom, or, our high school, I think at that time was around 20% people of color. So we weren't in the majority by any means, but we were a sizable presence at the high school. And I think even if you had asked me back then whether or not race is an issue in our school, I would have said, no, of course not. We all get along to one degree or another. We spend time with each other, and things are good. Things are fine. But then there would be these small moments that would pop up that would be like, maybe things are not as they seem. And one of them is what you allude to in the book, which is this conversation on affirmative action that went all wrong. It just went terribly wrong. And I remember thinking to myself, initially being kind of upset at this person who I think I would have considered a friend, and hearing her thoughts made me think, oh, maybe I should investigate what she really thinks about me and my color, and maybe even how I got here. But as I sort of stepped emotionally away from that particular instance, I had to think a lot about not just her as an individual. She was like 17 years old, but I had to think about the school and what our school was teaching or furthering, whether intentionally or not, around race, by presuming that living in harmony was enough. The fact that there weren't any racial incidents was enough. The fact that most of us would have, kind of considered each other friends was enough. But that there wasn't more. There wasn't an intention to unlearn racism. There wasn't a prodding. There wasn't a risk taking to peel back the layers in which whiteness and Christianity have had an unfortunate meeting.
Yeah, I'm reminded, so Dr. Beverly Tatum out of Spelman College writes in a book the book's why do all the Black kids sit together in the cafeteria, but it's her classic metaphor of racism as a moving sidewalk, that standing still is moving with the structures, with all the issues, even when you don't feel like you're moving towards it.
That's right.
You're still in this, like you say, that not helping to unlearn it, that really takes that sort of turning around, that sort of metanoia to, put some Christian language on it.
That's right.
To walk against the moving sidewalk.
I think that I'm glad you raised that point, because so often I think just having the presence of diversity, right, is enough for white people to think, okay, we're doing it, right? Like this is the hard work. Just the hard work is bringing the diversity, right? As opposed to investigating it and interrogating it. And, and so I think that's where my school was living. Like, great, we've done it. There's diversity here. And now one incident in 4 years, at least in my 4 years. And really sort of coming to consciousness that just having the diversity isn't enough.
Yeah. So I want to stay a little bit in a couple of school stories you have, and then I do want to get into kind of the Christian nonprofit complex, if you
sure.
But you also lifted up, some other stories that were maybe a different option for schools. So, help me with this name, Mr. Slavinsky.
That's it.
Yeah. I was just intrigued by his example of how he navigated. You just mentioned the presence of diversity isn't enough, and trying to dig into conversations without tokenizing, without ostracizing or otherizing the folks that are in the room, being able to honor them, honor experience without, shining the glare of a spotlight on somebody. Right. It was just another kind of early experience that you wrote about that I thought was enlightening or anecdotal for others that are trying to do things, navigate these situations.
I so appreciated Mr. Slavinsky because he taught my freshman English class, and it was the first English class I had been in, I think, that did not just stick to white authors. And when I say that out loud, that sounds really simple, right? Like, just didn't stick to just white folks. But it was a big aha, because previous to that, I was learning about white folks in school and learning about Black authors at home. And they were just, the two did not meet. And so to sit in a classroom where my teacher thought that it was important that white folks know authors of color was a big deal. And that he was adept at asking them the same kinds of questions that he would have asked when we were reading Shakespeare or when we were reading Edgar Allan Poe. He asked about the time in which the author lived. He asked about language. He asked about how they wrote. He expected the classroom to dig in just as much with authors of color as we did when we were reading folks that we would sort of expect to be read in high school. And it shocked me, quite frankly, because I was ready for exactly what you were talking about, the tokenizing, for me to suddenly become the teacher in the room. And he didn't demand that of me. He really respected my boundaries, even without us talking really at all. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And it was wonderful for me to be in a class where I was expected to learn about authors of color, It was so nice to need to write someone else's name on the quiz besides MLK and Rosa Parks. Like there are other people that I'm expected to know. It was really glorious. And I didn't write this in the book, I don't think. But Mr. Slavinsky was teaching in a Catholic school, but he was a Messianic Jew. And so a part of me sort of wonders whether or not even that difference, in his own sort of marginalization, made him that much more aware of what it was like for us as students of color to be quote the only ones so often in our classrooms.
Yeah. And it has such an interesting effect on all folks in the classroom. I mean, I remember my own self as sort of what has become a professional teacher's pet in many ways, always learning to the test and,
right.
getting the grade and like being the good kid.
Yes.
I distinctly remember the thought in high school that, okay, this stuff we're learning in February or this one little chapter in the book, I can skip that part. I don't have to worry about that part. We're going to talk about it for a day, but it's not going to be on the test anyway. Listen. I distinctly remember with my like grade oriented little brain.
That's right.
I knew I could skip that part.
Yep.
And that it would, of course no one ever told that to me.
Right.
But somehow picking up this idea that we're going to do it for a minute, we're going to give it its time, and then, but it's not actually
back to normal.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
And then conversely, it's a couple of chapters later, but clearly the effect that it has on you, because you say somewhere along the way, I picked up the unspoken belief that I was made for white people,
That's
just
right.
this idea that when it does come up,
that's right.
You have a job to do to serve, those in the classroom, explain, blah, blah, blah. And like I say, it's not in the same chapter, it comes a little bit later, but the line is there, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I was the same way in terms of how I approached education. I was definitely the good kid. I was, in the honors classes and, all that jazz. And I was so, both Mr. Slavinsky's class was an honors class. And then there was another like English/history class that I took that was also like an honors thing. And they too were extremely focused, intentional on incorporating authors of color, incorporating Black history as part of American history. And it's only in this conversation, Katelin, I'm recognizing that all the sort of pockets where that quote unquote diverse education was happening were in honors courses. And I now am wondering whether or not the other courses were doing the same thing, or if it was only this sort of specific population of students that was receiving that particular education. I don't know the answer to that.
That's really interesting. I'm thinking about my own education and then also those around me. A lot of folks' first exposure to a richer, deeper dive into, histories and arts and experiences of other cultures that were not white often don't and come until college, and even then it's like elective courses that you have to pursue.
That's right.
It takes that extra intentionality as though it is this like upper level, like unattainable thing.
Right.
And yeah, interesting. Because that has all sorts of implications.
It does. I am going to have to think about that. We might have to incorporate that one into the next book.
That's right. There you go. There you go. So I do want to extend then some of our conversation into, the working world, the adult world that, I at least pretend to participate in these days. And this intersection of Christian spaces, particularly white Christian spaces, and race and racism. Because I think Christianity as like an institution, not as a faith per se, is in a really interesting spot, because it has, on the one hand, tremendous potential to just lead the charge and be beautiful and wonderful. All the language is there around, the intersection of justice and reconciliation, or the idea of, you have to, have repentance and changing your way. We understand things like generational sin and corporate sin. So like, we've got the tools.
That's right.
But don't necessarily live into it. And not only do we not live into it, but then there seem to be other things about the white brand of Christianity that actually lend itself to racism. And so how does that all come into play as you've been navigating a lot of these circles?
Oh boy. So many thoughts, Katelin, so many thoughts. So a lot of the Christian spaces that I have navigated, I chose purposefully because their language was so good, because they were talking about justice, because they were talking about multiculturalism, because, right, they had the buzzwords down, right? And to some degree, it had really good intentions, right? At some level had heard the call for being a multi-ethnic community, and we're trying to live into that call. Or at some point had read just how many verses there were on justice, and we're trying to live into that call. And yet, it's amazing to me how poisonous white supremacy is, even when the intentions to live into justice are good. It's so easy for white Christians to hear the call for justice and still want to be the savior, right? To have an idea for how the community could be made better and undermine every other voice that it should be in partnership with. How it's so possible to be for justice work to be another notch on your belt, as opposed to, right, a lifestyle that is constantly critiquing the self. Here's a really quick example. So I worked, like I said, for like homeless shelters and food pantries and that kind of thing. And I remember being in a team meeting one day and the conversation revolving around the entitlement of the folks who were needing services, and what should be done about that, and how it felt to have people who were so entitled to not just the one can of green beans, but 2 cans of green beans and a ham, right? And I just remember sitting there thinking, but isn't the whole point of what we're doing to give dignity? And if it would take just 1 extra can of green beans to make someone feel dignified, let's give them 5 cans of green. Like, what are we talking about here? Right? But it was because the mentality, even though, right, if I had asked any of those folks, do you care about the poor? Do you care about the homeless? Do you care about, right? The answer would have been, of course. Of course I did, right? But it's so easy that when you stop interrogating, when you think that you've made it, when you think you're doing it, when you think you're on the right side, for white supremacy to still seep in and to be the driving force that says, oh, but this is still mine and I'm just giving it to you.
Mm-hmm.
This is the work that I'm doing to be a good person, and you better not threaten that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I mean? I still own this. This is really still my food pantry. This is still my shelter, and you should be grateful that I'm here to serve you. Right? Like that turn happens so fast and it's so subtle initially, but it has such big ramifications.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, this idea of saviorism,
yes,
white savior complex, where it's subtle because on the one hand, in Christianity, I mean, we're always supposed to like identify with Christ and become more Christ-like, and like this is who Christ is, and so therefore we, but how quickly and easily we in our humanity can turn that into something incredibly toxic.
That's right.
That ostensibly is a good thing, right. Christ-like, it's
right. Yes.
To then be so poisonous.
That's right.
And damaging.
That's right.
And how to, keep ourselves on the right path. I guess Dr. Tatum's in my head right now, but
it's a good person to have in your head.
You talked about it seeping in, and her other metaphor is around racism being a smog. That you don't always see it, but we're always breathing it in.
That's right.
Well, what your words triggered for me is, okay, but I live in a city. I know there's smog. That still doesn't keep me from breathing it in.
That's right.
We can be super racially aware.
That's
we
right.
We know there's a smog, but you're still breathing it. And
that's right.
Just to extend her metaphor on that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And that's really what I'm trying to get at in this book, Katelin. I'm glad you sent us down this path because I have been intentional about being around the folks who love justice, right? And so when I wrote this book, I'm really grateful that the audience has extended itself beyond what I imagined. But when I wrote the book, I imagined that people of color would read it, particularly people of color who are surrounded by white folks a lot. And if white people were going to pick it up, I assumed it would be the white folks that I've been around, right? Those who are already committed to justice, those who chose a multi-ethnic church, those who are making effort already. And to say, even though you're making an effort, I need you to know that the smog is still present.
Mm-hmm.
That really is, it's trying to make the smog visible for those who are aware that they're still breathing it in and can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that's a perfect metaphor. I'm trying to make the smog visible in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the onus is then once folks see it, what are you doing about it?
Right.
Because you can sit by and say like, oh, look at the smog.
Right. I see it now.
Right. There was one person in your stories and experiences. I think this was in the context of the bus trip.
Yes.
That you all took. But one person that finally stood up and said, doing nothing is no longer an option for me.
Huge.
You can know you're sitting there breathing smog, but what are you doing about it?
What are you doing about it? And, it's really funny. One of the conversations that I had with every single publisher who expressed interest in the book was, I refuse to put a 10 steps to no longer being racist in this book. I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it, Katelin. And for a number of reasons. One, because there is so much work to do.
Yeah.
I feel like it is dishonoring to the work of racial justice to even suggest that I could write out 10 steps for all white folks to become aware of the smog and fight against it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is so big. Pick a system.
Mm-hmm.
The health system, the education system, the criminal justice system, the education system, the housing system, right? Like, but I'm going to write 10 steps. All right? Like, no, I'm not doing it. And I think the second reason really comes out of a deep sense of spirituality, which is my really deep belief that God is still speaking.
Yeah.
Each and every one of us, that God is still creating the conditions for us to join our local community or our state community or our whole country or the whole world, you know, and can still say, here's what I want you to do. Here's the passion that I've placed within you. You thought you were just passionate about education, generally speaking. Guess what? I have real work for you to do.
Mm-hmm.
As you now think about race and racism. Oh, you thought you just cared about maternal health? Guess what?
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? I have some real work for you to do as we think about women of color. You know, like how dare I think that I could narrow this thing down for everybody? And yet I do hope that as I tell these stories and as I sort of open up my life to people, that white folks in particular who are reading the book are paying attention to how they are feeling and to what they're thinking and to what those words did for them. Doing nothing is no longer an option for me. Why did that resonate so deeply? Right? You know, when that like conviction comes and you want to throw the book across the room, right? You know what I mean? Like, why? Interrogate that. Why? Why did that make you so upset? Why did that resonate so deeply? Why did that hurt your feelings? You know, like I really hope that in some respects, the white folks who are already in this work will be reinvigorated to see the smog again. Mm-hmm. And to rise to the challenge, to go deeper, to go further, to recommit their lives again in a way that too many white folks have checked off the box.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And that's such a danger, you know, I think you called, you know, notches on the belt of being like, you know, a good, you know, justice-minded, you know, Christian or whatever. And, and how preposterous to think, and really, I think people, if they interrogate their own theology, would totally agree. There's no way there could be a 10-step process for any aspect of our lives, you know. Right. There's nowhere in scripture where it's like, you do these things, you're done, you qualify. Right. And it is such a journey. And so, yeah, it's a funny thing to be asked to do. Yeah. But you're absolutely right in that. I mean, it's so pernicious, and I think it gets at, maybe, if I had to guess, just this desire to assuage guilt. Mm-hmm. You know, the beast that white guilt is, it just so wants absolution. Yes. You know? And can't sit in that uncomfortable place for very long. Totally. And again, our theology could speak to these things. I mean, we know it's important to be convicted when we go astray and go wrong. Like, that's a good thing. But we also know that being mired in guilt is actually really paralyzing. Right. It separates us from God, or separates us in relationship from, you know, wherever that guilt is coming from. That's right. And so theologically, we understand that being stuck in guilt doesn't help. The conviction is good.
That's
being
right.
stuck in the guilt doesn't. And God calls us into those next steps along the journey. But there is no check off, no absolution, no like completion, until we all move on into perfection by God's grace at the end of days. But that's, in this world, you can't check the box. There is no box.
There's no box. And here's what I think, Katelin, and this idea just occurred to me. I think that even if I tried to answer that question for every white person who wants to ask it, well, what do I do now, right? I think my response would be wholly incomplete, would be a travesty, would be so small, so minuscule compared to God's answer.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what am I going to do, Katelin? Like tell you to go read a good book? Do you know what I mean? Like what plan? And I halfway know you, right? like what plan could I come up with for you? Sure. That would be better, that would be deeper, that would be more holy, that would even compare to the journey that God has for you.
Right. Yeah. And so you alluded to the idea that, some of the readership for this has been maybe broader than you initially anticipated. And so what's that been like? What's the reception been like? And just interacting with some folks that.
Sure. I think first, let me say that the trolls still exist. Like I don't want to suggest that my book is just like swept across white America. I don't want to suggest that. But as I said, I thought that this book would only resonate with folks who could already define white supremacy. Right? Like folks who are further enough in the journey that they could read a sentence that starts, white people can be exhausting, and laugh, right? Like you just did. Because they've been in this work long enough to have been exhausted by other white people, And so it has surprised me how many folks who know that there's something wrong, right? Who know that racial injustice exists, but are completely unpracticed in sort of the lexicon of racial justice, right? Who haven't been doing this long enough to consider themselves having a belt, let alone notches in the belt, right? So like I just talked to someone who loved the book, who said, well, Austin, here's one thing that I hear all the time from white folks as like this conversation about racial justice is happening. And that isn't talking about it creating more division? Isn't right? And that's not a new one, right, Katelin? For a lot of folks in this work, that would be like see, white people are exhausting, like, right? Like, see, that's it. But for him, even though he knows internally that's a cop-out, right? He hasn't been in this work long enough to know how to respond to it. He doesn't have the language yet. He hasn't heard enough thoughts from people of color or even from white allies to formulate a response to that. He just knows, that don't sound right. Right? Like that doesn't, something about that doesn't seems off. And so I've been really encouraged by the number of people who are not yet in the work, right? But just sense that something's not right here and have appreciated reading the book, even though I hold no punches. And I really, really thought, honestly, Katelin, that even for someone who's a newbie, that my book would be a turnoff because it's not nice enough and comforting enough. And so glad you're here. Won't you stay a while? Right? Like it's just not. sweet enough, to keep people reading. And so I've been really encouraged that there have been a lot of white folks who are like, whoa, this is a lot of new information, but I like it. Give me more.
That's interesting, because I think it does speak a little bit to where we are right now in society. And this is something I've really been struggling to understand and process and react to.
Sure.
Even in my own self, because some time ago, and I guess maybe as we were maybe first interacting, I'm not even sure how far back that goes, but it's been a while. I mean, it was different. It felt
so different.
Just like a different vibe.
Yep.
And I've been really wrestling with, are things worse? Are things better? Conversations are happening, but there are definitely not good things. I've been really trying to figure out where we are in this place and time. And I've gotten thrown a little bit. I mean, it almost feels like, the history is so long.
Right.
But if we look in very recent history, the last 40 or 50 years, we had kind of Jim Crow, explicit racism.
Right.
That, then kind of went into this time of colorblind racism.
That's right.
And we over and over have seen racism evolve.
That's right.
And sort of each time kind of new laws and structures are put in place, it can evolve into something different. And so, I mean, on some level, that just speaks to the importance of coupling, heart changes and law changes.
That's right. That's right.
The law changes are incredibly important because it affects people's behavior and keeps folks safe or not.
That's right. That's right.
And systemic policies have put so many issues in place. We need systemic policies to change.
Yes.
And racism continues to evolve to subvert those policies if we're not working on hearts as well, where the law really doesn't have jurisdiction over hearts. That's where the church can come in.
Woo!
And
Katelin,
so
you are preaching to me right now. Yes, sister.
It's one of those things, and we see it continuing to evolve. And so we had this kind of this colorblind racism season.
That's right.
And we saw some of the stuff that, New Jim Crow, all these kind of evolutions that thrived really well in a colorblind racist society.
Yes.
And now we're almost in like a post-racial society. And I don't know what that means. And so it was interesting that you alluded to just the time, the sort of the Kairos moment for your book.
Yeah.
And there being a space, an invitation, an audience that might not have, I mean, all these white folks that you're talking about that are kind of really new but receptive.
That's right.
I just don't know if they would have existed 5 years ago or what have you. They would have just been like, wow, what is this? But they know something's up and are hungry.
Right.
But they're also kind of in that place because of a lot of ugly stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I know that I've not articulated a question.
No, I'm so with you. Let's think this through together. I think the timeline is absolutely right. I wonder if we should talk about it as the racism of the 50s, 60s, and leaking into the 70s as having gone underground in order to create those systems that you just talked about, mass incarceration, right? All those systems, right? That it goes underground. It becomes part of the soil, right? In which racist structures can exist.
Yeah.
Without having to actually talk about racism, right? And now we got to a season where we were beginning to name those structures. at least think about undoing them, right? In this era of the Black president.
Mm-hmm.
And all that racism that was just in the soil was is now bearing fruit, right? And I think it's frustrating for folks like you and me because we were never living in the Black president utopia, right? That we were busy pointing out how the subtleties, the ground, the smog, right? Like we were like, yes, Black president, that's great. And also mass incarceration, and also this racist tirade, and also, right, what's happening in our churches, and also, right, because especially right now, because things feel so heavy, I think it's hard for us to remember the ways racism was beginning to manifest itself during the Obama presidency.
Yeah.
Right? That feels like glorious right now compared to this, but that was stressful. I distinctly remember when Obama gave that last State of the Union, and he said that he couldn't run for, office again, and the conservatives cheered. And he was like, because I won both times. Right. But that like level of animosity existing right up to the end of his presidency.
Right.
And I remember at that moment, after I stopped laughing, turning to my husband and saying, I need this to end because this is stressful. Watching people disrespect this president simply because he is Black over and over and over and over again in unprecedented ways to treat a president is too stressful for me.
Yeah.
I need him to be done. I need him to go enjoy his life. Right? But now the stress I was experiencing then feels like nothing compared to the stress that I feel on a daily basis now,
Right.
And so, it's so, know that I'm with you. I'm with you and trying to wrap my mind around what this season is.
Yeah. And I feel like there have been so many folks that have done a lot of really good work around pointing out the smog and saying, the soil is bad.
That's right.
The smog is there. And in so many spheres these days, it's not subtle anymore. I mean,
that's right.
The smog is so thick, we're choking on it.
That's right.
And
that's right.
So then what? What does the role become? I mean,
it feels like the fruit of things still unresolved, right? It feels like the heart change that you mentioned, the lack of heart change that you mentioned, and that we never really convinced the country that racism was bad. Right? Never. We never have convinced the country that white superiority is a lie and that Black inferiority is a lie. Never. Yeah. Never. We changed laws, but we never have ever dug to the root that created those laws in the first place.
Yeah.
And I sense, history will prove us to be right or wrong, Katelin, but my sense is that we are having a revival of when racism was okay. Because that's what we never talk about, was that there was most of this country's life, it has been just fine to be racist. That didn't mean you were a bad person. That didn't mean that you were, right? Like owning slaves wasn't a terrible thing to do for a long time.
Right.
Right? Like it was a badge of honor. Following the Jim Crow signs wasn't a problem. if you kicked out a Black person because you had a sign that said no coloreds here, that didn't mean you were a bad person.
Right.
Right? Like for most of the country's life, being racist has been fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are seeing the anger that people have kept buried over racism no longer being okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's kind of at this interesting point because at the same time that's happening,
Yep.
I'm thinking about a lot of evangelical churches that that I think very much are in line with that, are feeling a lot of those emotions that you've just identified.
That's right.
While at the very same time are in settings where like racial justice is trendy and we're going to wear like our Black Lives Matter t-shirts at like the worship concert or whatever.
Hello.
And those things are happening side by side.
Side by side.
And I just find it, I don't, to some extent, I'm at a loss. So then what do you say? You know, like,
right.
What do you point out when it is so thick that you're choking?
Yeah.
But there is at the same time this heightened racial awareness.
That's right.
Is it a disconnect? What's going? Just reconciling those two things have been a real challenge for me lately.
Yeah.
Even what to do with it.
Totally. And my sneaking suspicion, Katelin, is that we're going to have to employ a mix of old and new ways of thinking and of approaching racial justice. I think drawing inspiration from the turmoil of the 60s, right? Which I have to believe was jarring for people, right? In the same way that this era is jarring for us, right? So to watch people who had always supported segregation, maybe even enforced segregation, suddenly think, wait, but the ways MLK is interpreting my Bible, right, is something I've never heard before. You know what I mean? Like that same, like, whoa, that was happening then, I think is potential or for what is happening now. But I don't think that everything that was done in the 60s is going to work for 2018, right? And so I think that the civil rights movement was very creative in how it used the Bible and how it used art, songs, and how it used marches and protests, and how it utilized television, right? Like all the things that were new for that day.
Yeah.
Right. And I think our generation is going to have to figure out how to move politics in this generation, right? In this era, because the ways that MLK could move Lyndon B. Johnson are not the same ways that we can move Trump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I think this generation is going to have to draw inspiration from that era, but remix it for a new day. And I think that's true of the church as well. I think we gotta keep digging into scripture and not just relying on the ways that scripture got interpreted, you know, in the 60s, right? To end segregation, to end, right? We got to figure out, what is scripture saying about mass incarceration? Right? Like we got to figure out what the Bible is saying to us now, and hold on to the fire of the 60s, but use it to create new tools. We got to forge some new tools.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd love to see the church think ahead.
That's right.
That might be a little too much to ask for an institution that's usually like 10, 20 years behind, but if only we can not just, think in real time, right, but even think ahead.
That's right.
Because I mean, mass incarceration is a great example. I mean, there is a heightened awareness. There is some movement on it. There is a whole bunch of folks that have kind of waken up to that. And interestingly, now we see folks both on the left and the right.
That's right.
Feeling like it's a travesty, maybe for different reasons. I mean, if it's like government overreach and overspending and like all this waste of our tax dollars, like, okay, fine. And so maybe there's some consensus with that.
That's right.
But then, so what comes next? So now let's look at, the parole industry. Who's going to be making money on parole? And I mean, like, we've already said racism evolves.
That's right.
To match the laws and policies.
That's right.
I mean, how many years did folks work on decriminalization, work against the war of drugs? And now we see a bunch of white folks making profits on pot and this stuff. That's right. And so that's good people doing good work. And how do we get ahead of those next manifestations, those next evolutions of racism? I'd love to see the church live into that. We're so often just playing catch up, let alone getting ahead of it. So I don't know, maybe that's a bit too much to ask.
I think the church is going to have to continue, particularly the progressive end of the church is going to have to continue to die to white supremacy, even in the way that it wants to be the leader.
Yeah.
Because when the church has been at the forefront, it's been because people of color were leading the charge. Right. And we're imagining a new way. And we're saying we don't have to live like this anymore. And I think, I see no current evidence that any other way could exist in this moment, that looking forward means following the church of color.
Right. Absolutely. And there is precedent for that. Right. That we've seen such great legacies.
That's right.
But where was the white church?
Where was the white church?
It wasn't there, or at best, it was following along. And
that's right.
That's cool.
Yep.
But I think you're absolutely right that, knowing where there's been good success before is often where we can find the success going forward. And so much of your experience that you write in your book is testimony to that. These so many white organizations, with good intentions.
That's right.
That just fall so short. And just the heartbreak that those high ideals and good words on the page then just don't match the actions and the behavior. I think that's true for our institutions, our ministries, our programs, but also true just for the whole body. That the juxtaposition of the ideals and the heartbreak of not getting there. That's not a strong position from which to lead.
I love it. Yes, agreed. Cosign.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a mess. I've been trying to wrap my head around it, and the juxtaposition between microaggression and macroaggression, and the interplay between those things, how they loop into each other in this vicious feedback loop that I think has always been there, but just really manifests itself that that macroaggression makes the microaggression more okay, which then leads to more macroaggression. And like I say, that's always been there, but it just seems so much more heightened. Yeah. Or maybe just the loop is faster. I'm not sure.
Right. Oh, man. Yeah. These days are hard, Katelin. They are. They're really hard. And over the last weekend, I've been traveling a lot lately, and so what I'm about to say is like not even close to being fully formed. But I keep wondering what it means. What it means to be a Christian in this era. And what I mean by that is what does it mean to be people of hope? What does it mean to believe that the truth will set us free? What if Christians believed that we were made for this moment in history? As opposed to cowering under it, as opposed to fearing it, as opposed to longing for harmony for the sake of our own comfort. What would it look like? What would it mean if pastors and priests and spiritual guides across the country with one voice said, this is what we were created for.
Yeah.
This moment right now, and all of its destruction and all of its heartbreak and all of its vicious cycles. Like, this is our time to rise up. This is what we were created for. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very unfinished thought. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's the question I've been asking.
Yeah. I love it. And, hope is an interesting thing. Ta-Nehisi Coates got so much pushback.
So much.
With regard to his position on hope, but there's so much realness in there. And yet hope is a little bit the domain of the church,
Yeah.
And so, it is, wrong on so many levels for anyone to, you should have hope, blah, 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 blah. It just doesn't, it just doesn't work. I noticed Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is written to his son.
That's right.
Which on some level means hope. But, I don't know. And then I'm also reminded of some of Christina Cleveland's writing where she has said, hopelessness is a mark of privilege.
Yes.
It's a thing for white people to be able to throw up their hands and be like, this is impossible. Nothing to be done. I'm hopeless. That's a mark of privilege because you can afford to just give up.
Isn't that the truth?
And so it's interesting that you bring up this idea of hope because it's kind of where, your whole book drives and you walk that line between those two perspectives, which are both so real. You say, I ask myself, where is your hope, Austin? And the answer, it is but a shadow. And, you talk about, I think very eloquently walking that line. You close, when the sun happens to shine, I bask in the rays, but I know I cannot stay there. That's not my place to stand. I abide in the shadows and let hope have its day and its death. And my duty is to live anyway. And I think that's absolutely right. And, to know that it's there, to know that it is but a shadow.
That's right.
And to know how to navigate that is so much of, I think, the perspective that you bring that's so important.
Oh, thanks so much, Katelin.
Absolutely. So I very much enjoyed it. Definitely recommend that folks check it out. I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. Been a conversation with Austin Chan Brown that I've been thrilled to have. Any closing words for us?
No, friend. I, again, just want to repeat that I'm so grateful that you took the time to do this. And I'm so grateful to have like a Twitter friend in you. As someone who was there, like we mentioned earlier, before the phrase Black Lives Matter, to be in this work with you, to have longevity with you is so meaningful. And so I just want to say I'm grateful for you and thank you for this conversation.
Very grateful for you and super excited to have your book out. And maybe if you'll close just by telling folks where they can find you, where they can follow you, that sort of thing.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Yeah. So my website is austinchanning.com. And then Twitter is my friend. And recently Instagram too. And so I'm at Austin Channing at both of those places. And on Facebook, my full name, Austin Channing Brown, is where you can find me. So I love the socials. So come hang out with me, y'all.
Most excellent. Certainly have enjoyed and been enriched by doing so myself over the years. So thank you once again. And thank you to everyone that joined us and watching with us. My name is Katelin Hansen, and this has been another MennoNerds broadcast.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.